I want to point out very specifically that getting somebody else involved with doing your agenda not only not being simply a psychological ploy of some kind, is also, based upon the example I was using that I'm going to expand upon, it is not a form of arguing. Remember the example I made up of going into a complaint department and immediately make them join into your agenda by sitting it down and saying, does Kmart no longer check products even from somebody as big as General Electric? All right, it is not arguing. Never is it arguing, and I'm going to use arguing tonight as long as the tape holds out, as a form of resistance. The kind of resistance that's necessary to make things work, the kind of resistance that's necessary to understand, to have any perception of how things work in the 3D world. That anything has resistance if it is alive. Everything from having the resistance of gravity and all, even the most simplistic forms of physical laws involved, all the way to that which would appear to be intellectual, emotional, psychological resistance between people and within your own nervous system. To get somebody else to do your agenda, you cannot do it on the basis of arguing. If the resistance is there, which is inherent in arguing, and it's there, what you're going to have is you're going to have interference. You're going to have a possibility that's going to range all the way from severe interference all the way to absolute defeat of them participating in your agenda. And there's a reason. And I've talked around the edges of this many times, and for you people who might be newer to seeing this, it's going to sound psychological, and it's going to strike probably many of you that, aha, how astute, what a new way of looking at things psychologically. But remember this, to psychologically. Psychologically is even a poor metaphor for metaphor. But verbally, since there has to be resistance, since the sound waves have to come from here and have to hit your ear, there has to be resistance, and part of the resistance has to be in your own nervous system, not only for the eardrum to resist the sound wave and then be able to hear it, but then internally, for you to be able to hear anything intellectually, you've got to go, nah, well, maybe a little, but nah, not the way you put it, or you overdid it. All right, so there has to be that kind of resistance. But you're going to have absolute, at best, half efforts, that is non-success, if you attempt to engage someone else to bring them into doing your agenda, and it ends up, whether it starts out that way or not, but if it ends up being a form of argument, no one can deal with somebody else's agenda on the basis of them resisting it. And if you're going to argue, you have resistance built in. Resistance. Think about medieval warfare, at least before gunpowder in the West. Arguing, being a form, now remember, of resistance. Arguing is like using the crude, classic, basic sword. You remember the nice wide one you see in the movies? It's like using that, and it's you and someone else going at it, and they're very clumsy. Remember, just take the ones from the movie if you don't want to go look it up in the encyclopedia, if they had a name. But the nice wide, it took two hands at times to wield it. All right, arguing. And I'll repeat one more time, to consider this to be actually a psychological interplay between two people, if that's as far as you can take it, God bless you. Because that's not what we're talking about. But arguing, that kind of resistance, amounts to the crudest form of interplay with those kinds of swords that are clumsy, to the point that you had to hold them in two hands, and it's whang, it's back and forth, back and forth. Now that is the nature of all argument. That is the nature of ordinary resistance as it is manifested in the life of man, between peoples. To get somebody to do your agenda, to engage, even though I hope this didn't slip your sight. Jump back to my example right quick. You attempting to get the complaint person into your agenda. From the other person's view, if I suddenly jumped out and asked them to analyze what was going on, there was some sort of psychological test going on and they were an unwitting participant, and I said, how is it you feel your relationship? What's going on between you and this guy out here? He's in on it. Their feeling would be, which it is with most customers, but their feeling would be if I said, put a word on it, they would probably come up and say, well, he's arguing with me. Even though if you were doing exactly what I said, you were not arguing. You were questioning the person. But their feeling would be, if they thought about it, I suggest you, if I said just an everyday word, what's this person doing? And they would finally get to, if not immediately, they'd say, well, he's arguing with me. On the basis that evidently he does not have a sales receipt, because he won't admit it, and he just started right off, he's asking me questions I don't know anything about. I'm just here to return people's money if indeed they follow the rules and they in some way can fit into the structure that this company has detailed to me that would deserve a refund, that would warrant a refund. But their feeling would be, why don't you understand, even though you are not, if you know what you're doing, that you are not engaged in an argument, their feeling very likely would be to come down to the word that, yeah, the person is arguing with me. It is a kind of clash going on between me and that other person. But it can't be that way to you. It cannot be that kind of armed conflict down to a crude level of two-handed swords that are very clumsy. And the best you can do, since I came up with it, just go back to Hollywood, since I still think they're a better reteller of history than Gibbons or Hamsters or anybody. Is this wham, and then the other person goes wham. Of course, one reason I guess they do it, it cuts down on a multiplicity of takes, and the choreography on those kind of swords is pretty simple, because they just tell the one guy, you do like this, and when he comes down, they tell the other guy, you put yours up and block him. And then you step back, and then you hit him, he'll block you. It's simple. But it just goes whang, blam, bang, blam, just back and forth. To get somebody else to do your agenda would amount to this: to carry the picturization forward is you have to have in your hands a rapier, a foil. A rapier would be better. Your engagement into what with the other person may seem quite well to be an argument. By using the kind of questioning method, you're turning that potential conflict of these clumsy, crude swords on your part, you become a handler of a rapier, to the point that what you're doing with a person is very subtle. Your attack, if you want to call it an attack for a second, is very lithe. It is to the point almost that you can tickle the other person, wherein they believe that they're still in some sort of combat. And in a sense, you are in a combat with them, but you are not engaged in the conflict. You're not engaged in the dance, with your weapon being clumsy, crude, simplistic. I would like for everyone, since I've gotten this far, this deep, to re-ponder the full impact of the story of Socrates. And the people's, forget whether it was history or not, doesn't matter. If it was a good myth, it's better than history, because it's the human nervous system talking in ways that humans have yet to actually execute, and if they did, it was so excruciating and so fleet they didn't even see it, and so they make up stories. But Athens's, the people's hostility towards Socrates. Think about it. Now, I've talked about it and used that as a grand example. The hostility. Did he argue with people? And now you're going to have to give me my all the time leeway because I'm not going to stick with Plato's retelling of it absolutely. But here is closer to the reality of it, no matter how it might interfere with the literal translations that are left. If Socrates did not argue with these people, it was not a combat like this, because that does not upset people to the point that they want to have you slain and shipped out. Nay, nay, not hardly. He did not argue with them. He questioned them. He made them do his agenda in a certain way. Not in the way I would have told him to if this was actual history and if he was not trying to commit suicide. But I want you to see what I'm pointing at. The hostility was not caused by argument. It was not caused, let's just say that I was talking to somebody and all you had was just a fleeting impression of what the story of Socrates was about. And that you just heard enough. Or perhaps they did some children's version on PBS, or they wouldn't do it that badly. But at any rate, you just had the kind of crude, simplistic impression that he was a guy that went around arguing with everybody, and finally the people had enough after 50 years and said, you know, stop all that stuff. But he did not argue. He did not ask somebody, he did not go up to a general, a poet, a painter, and say, I've seen some of your poetry. I've read all kinds of poetry, and to me, poets are useless. Or he didn't even start off and say, tell me what poetry is. And the guy tried to tell him, he said, well, boy, that's a waste of time. That sounds dumb, if that's what it is. He did not do that. He did not engage in combat on the basis of using crude swords. That is not what caused the hostility. And of course, we're talking about serious hostility. Serious resistance. That's not what caused it. Think about it. And then what is subtle and silly and elusive enough is for me to point out to you that what caused that kind of rage, not necessarily on a literally historic basis, but enough that such stories survive all over the world, not just the Socrates story, was that he was forcing them into his agenda. He was not giving them the dance wherein it is a kind of good Apache. Does everybody know what that is? A form of a tangled dance of him and the other person, if you don't like the fighting with crude swords, of pushing back and forth on each other. Because as long as there's that kind of ordinary resistance, you will not have the kind of hostility that will cause a whole city to carry the myth, a whole epoch of history to turn on one guy and say, hey, enough's enough. Arguing will not produce that. Something much more subtle. If you're dealing just with arguing, not only are people not upset to the point of overt hostility, but the arguing, the pushing back and forth, the resistance people expect. Life demands it. It is a kind of energy is necessary within the framework, the energies that are derives from life, parts of them. Certain aspects of the energies would not be produced, would not be transmitted were it not for that kind of resistance. This gets down to the heart of, since I hadn't put it in direct words in years, gets down to the heart of anything in life, no matter how it struck your nervous system upon first hearing, even if you thought of it, no matter how decent, charitable, humane, or innocuous it sounds, if you're going to say it and it does not simply become an echo, that is, you say it once and it goes out and goes and falls down dead, then somebody is going to resist it, no matter what it is. That I think all of humanity should be healthier. Just pick out anything you can think of. Unless you're faced with, you're going to say, I think all of humanity should be healthier. And everybody you say that to, literally and otherwise, it's as though they didn't hear it. If it's going to have any life, then what's required Not just what is going to be potentially occurring, but what is required is there's going to be resistance. That is, there are going to be other humans stand up and say, wait, wait. And to use the form, the verbalized form, they will argue with it. Notice how much of the human nervous system, notice how much of the human history is taken up, not just with the conflicts, not just with the arguments, but by then other people during and after the fact going, heavens to Betsy, my God, how could people be so dumb? When will we ever straighten out? When will we ever see the light? When will men ever see the correct mode of action? How is it that one group, one person, can come up with such a splendid idea, and within a matter of weeks, months, years, generations, the idea has been forgotten. The idea has been perverted. It has been torted to the point that it's now its own opposite. My God, how can this be? No, it's how can it be otherwise once you see it, which is strictly rhetorical. It's not even worth that question. When I say that you should be getting people to do your agenda, or conversely, if you want to see another possible ultimate description of this, would be the refusal to do, for you to do, anyone else's agenda. Can you begin to see that by do the agenda, what I was trying to say fairly specifically the first two times I have mentioned it, is not limited to any example I could make up, such as returning something, such as trying to get somebody apparently to agree with you, or to somebody to leave you alone, or somebody to do something that you have planned for them to do. It's not that. It is to be in a way that is 3D, indescribable, as you step aside, not totally, because physically, at the very least, you cannot step aside from it, but as you step aside from it from your intentions, from your interests, from your thought processes, from your actual intelligence, you step aside from where everything has resistance. That's what the agenda that I'm speaking of is. It's not simply to make somebody do something you want, or to try and trick somebody to give you your money back when you didn't buy the item there. It's to keep from being surprised. It's to keep from being frightened. Because if you're anybody that's frightened, and everybody gets frightened at times, if you get frightened, you're surprised. So you shouldn't be surprised, because if you're not surprised, you won't be frightened. And some people get depressed. Some people get sad. I guess everybody gets sad a little bit. You shouldn't admit it. But if you get sad, that means that you were frightened. And if you were frightened, that meant you got surprised. So, you shouldn't be surprised. You should not be doing anybody else's agenda. Because if you do their agenda, you got surprised. Either that or you don't know what you're doing. So enough of you didn't have electric trains to follow the track backwards, all right? If you weren't surprised, then somebody else couldn't come up to you and say, don't you check the items you sell anymore? You don't work in the complaint department. You didn't expect that. But now they got you on the run. Now you're dancing backwards. You didn't even know you were going to dance. You were surprised. After surprise, you can draw out a family tree. After surprise, you can get frightened. After frightened, you can be depressed. Once you have accepted somebody else's agenda, then everything that is human is then possible. Everything that everybody else, including you at the old level, thinks and feels is now possible again. As long as you argue with yourself. Now think back to the fine people of Athens and Socrates. As long as you merely argue with yourself, there is no danger of any part of your dialogue buying the farm. There is no danger of anything radically occurring. As long as you argue. Now think about the dialogue within yourself. it does not necessarily have to go on that you're talking to yourself, but you do argue with yourself. If you did not resist and fight with what seems to be yourself, in case anybody has any doubt, then I'll point out the kinds of things that would not be occurring. You would not have any desire to change anything, because whatever desire to change that you ever had, you would have done so. You would now be, as they like to call it in religious circles, the big P. The big peckerhead? No. Perfect. That's what they like to call it in religious circles. That's why I like religious people. Because they like to talk about perfection, and then they like to point out that nobody's perfect, and of course if you're hanging around, you feel like you're right at home. You figure at least they're not going to pick on me here. That is until they find out that you didn't put anything in the collection plate, but that's another story. Think about the story of Socrates, and think about what I said, that it is not arguing that causes that kind of hostility. That as long as a Socrates, as long as part of your dialogue will simply argue, simply put up the ordinary form of resistance, nothing drastic will occur. One part of your dialogue will not be put to the sword, or the cup in this case. See if you can follow something really tricky. I may never have another chance to bring it up. Selling somebody something. Selling somebody or something is a form of getting them to deal with your agenda. Am I correct? To sell somebody something, first off, requires, if it's going to be necessary to sell somebody something, that they resist it. There are two specific levels. It's even important that I warn you beforehand of how tricky this is. There are two levels of people resisting. There are two levels out in the ordinary world of people attempting to sell other people something. And by something can be things, processes, get them to deal with somebody else's agenda. Overcome resistance. But there's resistance built in. It's not simply the salesman has to overcome resistance. It's not the salesman thinks to himself, well, I'll talk to this person and then I'll see if there's any resistance. And then I'll use the methods they taught me back in salesmanship school. It's not a question of will there be resistance. It's not that you attempt to sell somebody something and then they resist. Watch it. They've resisted already, or you would not attempt to sell them something. The two levels. Consider a level wherein we're just below the civilized line, the line of intellectual man. Figure it's people, they're just right down there. And I recall back a few nights ago, I pointed out to you that everything could be seen as having a primary purpose, and then it could be seen as having a sub-purpose, wherein people use it as a hobby. At this level, what do people have to be sold? In what way does one person, of course we're talking about life dealing with itself, moving energy about within its own body, but back to the area wherein men apparently are the manifestations of this, what sorts of things, or which of the levels, are being dealt with if we could divide humanity and say we're dealing with people now that they're just barely literate. They're just almost to the point that they're non-civilized. What do they have to be sold on? Now recall, I'm having to stretch reality because such people can't exist anymore because things are not a 3D world, they just appear to be that way. But intellectually, you should be able to hear this kind of example, which should scare you also. Not scare you, should make you understand more about the dealings of the intellect, that I can say, you understand this is not true, and you almost go, yeah, I almost can, and I say, but all right, and I'm going to describe it in this way, and you don't normally notice it, you described it just after you admitted, or thought you saw that, yeah, this can't be described, and yeah, I described it, you went, oh yeah. Something's wrong, but we'll go ahead. What do these people have to be sold on at that level? For instance, to make this, you got to follow that, I'm really making up an archetypical example. If we're dealing with people at that level, then they would still be scrounging, hustling each day just to feed themselves. They'd be at that level. So, let's take food. They would not have to be sold on the agenda of come eat. To take it back to the level of two people. One guy, back at this level, almost caveman times, let's just make it crude right quick. One guy decides, I'll be a restaurateur. It is not necessary for him to go out and walk along the ridges, get up on mountains and holler out to other caves or other cavemen and women, holler, come over here and eat, I got food. Not necessary. Do you hear me? He does not have to get them to deal with the agenda to eat. He does not have to get them to deal with the agenda of come over here, I've got food. Not hardly. He does not have to try and find somebody to put together a neon sign. He does not have to send out handbills. There is no resistance to being sold the agenda to eat, not when eating is a day-by-day proposition. You move right above the line. Then that thing that has a primary purpose, which all things do, eating, to keep the human race going, to keep you going individually. If we moved above that line, and you start imagining people that would now be talking about you, and we imagine now that you have moved up to that kind of level, then food can take on, can be used at the sub-level, the secondary level, the hobby level, which is very common nowadays, that food becomes a hobby. Being a gourmet, there are magazines, there are clubs to join. People go out, you people do it. And you go out and eating becomes a social occasion. It's not right or wrong, but it is now operating at the sub-level, not the primary purpose level. It's always there. Anything that can be a hobby for humanity has a primary purpose. And so you still eat to live. But food has now, in that sense, when you move above that level, has now taken on the possibility of it being used as a hobby, being used for a secondary purpose also. Then you have a different kind of resistance. Then you have a different kind of selling necessary. Then you have restaurateurs here in every civilized city in the world who have to go to great extremes to try and get you to come eat there. Not to come eat, because now we're not dealing with food at the primary purpose level. Your resistance, a corner you pass all the time, an old drugstore goes out of business, they keep working on it, and you go past it every day, and it begins to say, watch out, new restaurant, and then it says going to be Italian, nouveau cuisine. They put up a sign, they got a guy outside, you don't like the looks of it, and it says special, special. There's no parking place, you've thought about stopping there, you read a review of it, you resist it. Even if you said, if you had a nervous system this crude and quick, even if you said that, well, the first time I went by there I thought, boy, I'm glad there's a new restaurant opening up because I'll stop there. There was resistance to it. When it starts operating on the hobby level, that is, you didn't go past the restaurant and it said restaurant opening soon. It was not on the basis that right then, it was all you could do to drive your car. You were so weak from hunger. You may die within the next few minutes, and at first you thought it's an oasis. It said restaurant. and you just barely pull the car over, and you're about to die, and it says, opening soon. That would be back at the other level. That would be at the primary purpose level. At the level at which it is operating now, at the secondary level, you have resistance. Even if you say, I want a new restaurant, I'm glad we got a new restaurant in the neighborhood because I like to go out and eat. Don't say that because you're missing it. There is resistance. There's resistance that you got to go in and you got to check the place out. You go in, you wait to see how quickly you're served. The person you're with, your date or somebody, you have to say, I've seen better decor than this, or this looks reminiscent of that other place across town that opened up. There is resistance. The agenda to be sold, once it gets to the secondary level, is a different kind of resistance. I bring all this up not to talk about restaurants, not to talk about arguing, but to talk about the way energy moves in life, and ways in which it is misconstrued, ways in which it seems to be inexplicable, and it's very explicable. To those that can see the explicable. Sex. Obviously, as much as food, people got to fuck, or none of us would be here. The race would go, humanity would have to come up with something, life would have to come up with something to replace humanity. When it's down to the level, if we were back talking about just, if there was such a place, really, we were just almost talking about people who are just beginning to have a nervous system operate in the brain. And you've been there. As commonly referred to as just being extremely, almost blindingly horny. Nobody has to sell you on sex. But when it reaches a level, and this always ties in, although I said it's not that kind of clear demarcation mark, but the more civilized, the more sophisticated you get, then the things that have a primary purpose, which they all do if they're going to exist for any length of time, then more and more participation in that activity becomes, or operates at the level of secondary. Hence such things as pornography, that you almost now have to be the more civilized, the more blasé. It's almost as though you've got to be sold on doing that, which genetically, back at the level of genes, you've got to do. You or somebody's got to do, or we won't be around anymore, right? At the level of eating, at the molecular, at the cellular level, your body says, we got to eat, we got to eat. But then you move up to the civilized level, and your mind says, yeah, well, we don't have to eat here. I don't like their advertising. And the parking, they got no valet. I don't like the parking place that doesn't have valet parking. Sex, we got to screw. We got to make babies. We got to do it. But it gets up to this level, and you're not interested in having any more children or any children. Just interested in sex. It's a hobby. But then it even gets to the point of, well, let's see, do I want to have sex with this person or not? Oh, I don't know. She reminds me of last month's centerfold. Well, maybe. I'll check back with you, and if something better doesn't turn up, I'll come back and buy you another drink. That's a form of pornography. In other words, it's a form of selling that which at the primary purpose level needs no selling. No one has to present an agenda. No other person. Does it make any more sense now that I said the original caveman who's going to be a restaurateur does not have to say, attention, I've got some extra food over here. If he's got extra food, he's probably going to have to cover his ass and defend himself with everything available, because at that level, people do not have to be sold on eating. That's all they can do to find enough to eat. And if they suspect, if they can smell excess food somewhere, the man does not have to say, I'm going to sell off, or I'm going to swap off some of this excess food. I'm going to call it the restaurant business. Would you like to come eat? He'd be stampeded. But then when you reach the level that it is no longer in operation at the primary purpose level exclusively, then you must sell people on your agenda. Then people will resist the very thing that they have got to do at the primary purpose level to live. They will resist. You'll be outside saying, come in here and eat. We got great food. You'll love it. You'll love it. You go, well, and you've got to eat to stay alive. But now you're resisting. Well, I don't know. Let me see a menu. What kind of price range you got? You got a good wine list? You got any parking? Where's your valet? You're resisting. Now think about what hobbies are. Think about what takes up a civilized man or woman's time in life, what they think about. You do not think about actually eating to stay alive anymore, not you people. You may think a lot about eating, but not to stay alive. You do not think about eating at the primary purpose level. If you did, you'd be nuts. People just do not. What do you think about? You think about eating at the secondary level, at the hobby level, about where will I eat? Is that a nice place to eat? Is it the kind of place to be seen? Is it the kind of place you might even pick up some sex after you get through eating? Is it the kind of place I like to go? Does it relax me? You're not talking about food as a primary purpose anymore. You're talking about food as a hobby. Now, this really gets tricky. Listen quick. Your own dialogue. Take everything I've been talking about, a restaurateur at the level of trying to sell cavemen. That is to sell food, to sell sex on the level where it does not have to be sold, on the level where there is no resistance. And now think about, you move up to where the primary purpose is not that which seems to be the primary purpose for those doing it. Sex, eating, being a gourmet, being a enjoyer of good dining. It is not for the basis of eating anymore. And so the internal resistance that seems to occur in your own dialogue is now of a different form. I told you it was tricky. I'll put it to you. I'll get untricky for a second. The resistance is unwarranted for a real revolutionist. And it interferes with your enjoyment of things, all the way from eating to fucking, all kinds of things that you believe that you've got an interest in, that you like to pursue it as a hobby. Or maybe you do pursue it as a hobby, but then you suffer over it in some way. You argue with yourself about it. That's the reason why. I guess it shouldn't be surprising why it's been so long that I've been threatening to bring this up in some context and never did. At the very, very least, you should be able to hear enough to find it interesting. My example, to start with, should have been simple enough to hear verbally, whether it made any additional sense to you. That at a certain level, what I was describing before and still tonight, that things operate at two possible levels. That they're serving a primary purpose, such as food, keeping the human race, keeping you individually alive, and the race alive. And then eating becoming a hobby. It's not right or wrong, but then eating is a hobby. That you are not dressing up, you're not checking a book on dining out in Minneapolis tonight. You're not doing that on the basis, you may be hungry, you may not be in doubt about that, but you're not talking to your wife or your husband or your girlfriend. It's not on the basis that I've got to eat. I'm about to die. If you were, you would just run in there and open the closet and the pantry, and you just grab whatever's there and you would eat. You're going out now to eat, but you're going out to eat on the basis of pursuing it at the secondary level. It's a hobby. There is a different kind of resistance that goes on all the way from my caveman picturization of me saying that he would have no resistance. He does not have to sell anybody on the agenda of come over to my cave and eat. I've got some extra food. He does not. Contraire, now several hundred generations later, one of his grandchildren has opened a restaurant, and people still got to eat, the same way as the cavemen had to eat. But now, this guy has got to sell people on his agenda of come here and eat. And people go, I don't know. They look at the building, they look at the maitre d', they look at the front of the place, or they come to the window and look at the menu, and they make faces like, ooh. And they got to eat. But now it's a hobby they're pursuing. It is primarily, as far as they're concerned right then, it is primarily the secondary and not the primary reason that's driving them. That their participation right then in eating out somewhere, either at this restaurant or down the street, their purpose, their resistance is based upon as I don't have to do it here. It is a different kind of resistance. If you could change, I said I was going to make it simple and you thought I'd forgotten, or try to make it simple. If you could take the caveman and suddenly put him into the modern context, if you could reverse two of the participants, if you could reverse the salesman down here and his potential audience, that is the caveman that decided to go in the restaurant business, and then all the people who are hungry. And then up here the guy who is in the restaurant business, circa 1989, and then all his potential clients. If you could take one group and switch them, either way, then you'd have something. You'd have something extraordinary. You'd have a revolutionist that whatever he did, he would not be resisting in the ordinary sense. And vice versa. There would not be any resistance to start with that would apparently, if you had to look at it as 3D causation, which is not that simple, but that there's no built-in resistance, which is why he does it. It's why life needs it done. And everybody's walking around going, oh, I got a headache. Well, why did I do that? I've got to change. I got to do this. I got to do that. And there is yet another. Yes, yet another unknown, heretofore unsuspected description of what is going on inside the body of life and inside of your own nervous system. Right there. Turn the tape over. Stretch something a little further that I've already mentioned also into this, of not being surprised. Somebody doing this, I'll go ahead and say especially, should be seeking out new, at least intellectual food, but new kinds of experiences. You should enjoy discovering a brand new record, a brand new band, a new book, a new dress, a new hat, a new car. You should be doing that. But that is not being surprised. What I brought up night before last time we met, the kind of surprise, and I'm mentioning tonight that you should not be surprised, is you should not be surprised at that which should be known and expected. That's what you should not be surprised at. But it's not in some way that you have become, or are trying to become, even more blasé, sophisticated, or as they say in sophisticated circles, pseudo-sophisticated, which always proves whether somebody's actually sophisticated or not, if they want to differentiate it by saying, well, those who are pseudo-sophisticated. You just got to understand, even the dictionary Neil understands, if I remember correctly, what sophisticated actually means. And so those who say, well, that's not sophisticated, that's pseudo-sophisticated, then they are the living example of pseudo-sophisticated, except now you've got another level of pseudo-sophisticated, see? It is not that. It is not that. But when I say you should not be surprised, it's simply, and it's fairly easily put that I just did, you should not be surprised at that which should be known and should be expected. And yet in the city everyone is. And by now you should begin to have some little suspicions based upon, if nothing else, some of my picturizations. The cue to the slaughter. I mean, there was nothing else to do. Just taking things as they are now, which is stretching it, but just the way things appear to be now. If everybody staying in line that was not involved with some kind of activity, maybe like this, maybe whatever this is, but everybody else is staying in line, if they were just made to see, look, you know this, but God damn it, face up to it. You can't take your possessions with you. You're going to die shortly. There ain't no way out. Forget all these stories about heaven and hell. Nobody's ever been there. Your priest don't know. Your rabbi doesn't know. Your parents don't know. Nothing's going in the grave with you. You'll be forgotten within a month, maybe a day. I must suggest to you, without even trying to explain it, but you can hear that or you wouldn't laugh, that just based on the way things appear now, if everybody staying in line to be slaughtered acted that way, life would not be like it is. You'd probably have a lot of people committing suicide through osmosis. I don't know how you do that, but the line, all of humanity by and large just might begin to melt and just Everything we just stop, right? So everybody's got to have the hobbies, and to have a hobby, to use things at a secondary level, you've got to have a certain kind of resistance. And this kind of resistance ends up with you doing other people's agenda. And by doing other people's agenda, it requires what? That you continually, apparently, be surprised. When you're standing there in line, and everything that happens to people, they knew it was going to happen. Nothing unexpected happens. Nothing unknown happens to people, which I'll suggest is one reason that fantastic tales are so popular, as I point out, is that people can say, you can be staying in a line, I'm sure at the grocery store, and somebody pick up a paper and buy one of these things that says, my wife ran off and married the co-pilot on a flying saucer. And you might say or think to yourself, which is the same thing, of how can you read that stuff? Or you might ask the person, you actually believe that all these simple people you never heard of are the only ones visited by flying saucers? There are actually such things, but they don't ever land up at MIT or Berkeley. They don't ever try to find out whether Einstein's still alive. They end up with fishermen down in Tuscaloosa, Alabama. And the person might say, you're right, I know it's a bunch of hokum, but... And then you might say, well, why in the world do you buy it? Why do you read it? I'm just telling you why. Why do people go to these slasher movies? Why do people read comic books or stuff that says, boy, it gives me the willies to think about it? You might think, well, why in the world do you read it? I get nightmares. I get all excited. I scream. I throw up when I see movies like that. You think, well, why do you do it? And if they could tell the truth that they would say, that if they knew my terminology, they'd say, well, it's just a hobby. It's either that or go nuts. All right, that's at the secondary level. Now, I'm talking to you people. I'm not talking about finding a new band or a new album or a new dress or a new movie. It's down at the primary purpose level. Things also are known and expected, but the intelligence level that life produces in man is such that people continually, I've been through this, and every time I do it, almost all of you go, yeah, you're right, I see it. People continually will go, I can't believe this, I can't believe my wife left me, I can't believe so-and-so, and all you got to do is turn the verbiage just, I don't know, 2 or 3 degrees. Not even enough to run you off the highway. Just turn it just a little bit, and contrary, just within seconds, you can get people to go, well, I knew it was coming. No matter what the circumstance. Not just any I can make up, but any you can think of. The people say, my wife, I came home, I left today, and she said, we're going to have pot roast for supper. She kissed me goodbye, and I came home, and the house is empty. Everything's gone. She's gone. Just like that. And you had no cause to expect it. No! Here, have a drink. Or pat him on the back. So here, let me get you a glass of water. 30 seconds later, you can make people. They'll say, well, what amounts to, you say, you had no idea anything was wrong. I mean, it's a complete surprise. And just a few seconds later, they go, well, yeah, I saw it coming. All of that's meaningless to an ordinary person because now they're back, it's just a hobby. You know, now I can suffer over it. Maybe I can write a country and western song and make some money. It gets down to a very mundane, nothing necessarily that dramatic at all in your everyday life of what you apparently think about, what you apparently are talking about in your own dialogue, and there seems to be, at that standing in queue level, continual surprises. How can I think that? How can people talk about me that way? And you don't know what they're talking about. You're imagining that somebody talks about you that way. I can't. You mean so-and-so said that about me? Or you hear the news. So-and-so's invaded such and such place. My God. What do you mean, my God? Part of life's agenda for humanity is that it has got everyone on the defensive. This is not true, but at the 3D level, I've got to talk about things that apparently operate in pairs. Resistance. The dance, submission, domination. Life's agenda is this. It should be quite easy to see. That it's the dominant force. Can I understate things or not? Again, a short step from there to the worm people, ordinary folks, hollering about gods and Jehovah's and Allahs and Wallahs. Because everybody knows that they're dancing backwards to something. It's just obvious. We're not in charge. But then you got to forget that. Then you got to get into the secondary level that you can apparently be in charge. You can beat up a woman. You can misuse somebody. You can cheat somebody. You can kick a kid as you walk by. You can tell somebody you'll call them and not call them. You can exercise a certain kind of power yourself. A little domination. Pull up beside somebody in the car and holler, "Get out of my way, you dumbass," and then drive off real quick, see? So when you get down to the level of people standing in the queue, it's like they can push each other around. It's like they are dancing. But then you look at all of them as being one organism, the whole basic nervous system of humanity, and everybody knows. They don't know it, but everybody knows that they're dancing backwards. Everybody knows that they're doing somebody else's agenda. And they hope it's somebody benevolent, which is, of course, the idea of a God. And then the idea that some people, I know I'm trying, but some people seem to be dancing with somebody else. So it must be an anti-God because they're in conflict with me. What do you mean? Well, they resist me. That is, they seem to have an agenda and they want me to do it. Whereas and of course their agenda sucks and it's evil. But I got a good agenda and they won't listen. So then you got, the fights between good and evil and etc. Between the east and the west, and the north and the south, and the up and the down, the men and the women, the tall and the short. A real revolutionist would not be surprised at that which should be known and that which should be expected. And it's not a theoretical description I'm giving. It's not some kind of oblique encouragement I'm giving that you should be smarter and always stay on the lookout, which of course you should be smarter and stay on the lookout. But I'm not saying that. Heavens, that's not it. Of course that is it, but that's not it. You should not be surprised at that which should be known and should be expected. And everything that happens at the ordinary level of intelligence, everything that happens at line level is known and expected because you have already thought it. And if you don't know that, you don't know anything. I have really wasted my time with you individually. Anything that you think at that level is known and expected. There is no exemption from it. At that level, you do not think anything new unless we're going to say, all right, flying pigs is a new concept and I thought of it. Right. There is nothing new at that level. There is nothing to be surprised about. There is nothing unexpected going to happen. And yet, as long as what seems to be ordinary intelligence is operating episodically, as long as you live and die every day, as long as you have that kind of fragmented linear consciousness running, people are continually, at that level, surprised. I never expected this, until you get them just a second and say, "Oh, come on, didn't you?" And they go, "Well," especially if you say, "Well, good God, we all expected that. We've all been talking about it. And we always thought you were so intelligent." "Well, you're right. Yeah, you're right. I guess I was trying to elude myself. I've seen it coming a long time." And of course, 2 minutes later, I'm talking to somebody else. "I couldn't believe she did this. I'm so surprised." It is meaningless. But you have got to see that it's meaningless. You've got to see that at this level, anything that goes on in the normal course of the dialogue, anything that goes on that you have not produced through this kind of activity, everything here is known and expected. I just put it to you in a somewhat more humane way to start. That you should not be surprised. A real revolutionist would not be surprised at that which should be known and expected. Should be known and expected. At this level, if you know anything, then everything is known and expected because you have already thought it. Probably more than twice even. Let me be, I'll just throw caution to the wind. I'll bet if you actually check everything that you've ever thought, you've thought even more than twice. Now I'm guaranteeing you thought it more than once, but I'll bet you've even thought most things more than twice. You check on that sometime and see if I'm not right. How can you be surprised? The only way you can be surprised is to be, how shall I put it? Dumb. You've got to be ordinary. You've got to be operating at the old level of intelligence. You have got to be back at that old level of, in a sense, attempting to go along with the distraction of realizing that you're fixing to become worm grub. I always like to leave on an encouraging note. I know. A B flat. No, worm grub. Worm grub. I'm going to look off like I'm thinking that if I should say anything else at all. And see, with my other hand, I'm reaching for the cutoff valve here. I was going to move into my pensive mode, but I forgot what it was. It always seems to be just one step from that to being depressed. Which just goes to show, don't think you'll get depressed. See? Oh, if you do it the old way. That's what I meant to throw in. Bye.